I attended church from the time I was a baby, and my mother attended faithfully, and I went with her, and my father attended faithfully until he had what then was called a nervous breakdown, and he went into a very severe depressive state and did not attend church for the most of the rest of his life after that. I think because of my father's mental illness and the acute disappointment that I experienced in my relationship with him through that 25-year period, which started when I was about 10 years old, the hurts that developed inside of me were not just hurtful. I turned it into what I would say was contemptuous feelings for my father. Part of the issue with the contempt that I felt for my father had to do with inappropriate sexual behavior towards me. And that is very wounding. The incidents that happened that were traumatizing to me, I did not hold them inside. I always knew that they were in my memory. What I didn't know was the severity of what had happened. I believe it wasn't that I held them in secret, it was as if they were so painful that they just did not surface for a long period of time. So truthfully, it was rather shocking to me when memories started surfacing. They were a secret to me, so to speak, not something that I kept. The anger and contempt that I felt was pretty overpowering. And I didn't lash out in violence. It was more of an internal thing that I struggled with. And although they were probably justifiable, they weren't helpful to me, and I carried that into my adulthood, into my marriage, into the way I early on expected my children to behave or respond to me. There is a lot of pain and a tremendous amount of anger, and I turned that anger inward. If I wasn't using it to expect my husband and my children, my male children, to do everything I wanted them to do, the way I thought it ought to be done, then if I wasn't doing that, then I was turning the pain and the contempt that I felt inward. And I started that at a very early age. At age 14, pretty much, the anger and contempt that I felt for my father was so strong that I didn't have the tools to process it appropriately. So I turned that anger inward, and I began compulsively overeating. And that lasted in some form or another probably for 30 years. I ate to deaden the pain that I felt, or to mask the anger that I felt. And if my anger didn't come out in sarcastic comments, then it came out in just stuffing myself and pushing those feelings down. I guess the beauty and the frustration both about healing is that it's a process. And for me, it's been a long process. And I turned things over to God as I could, but it took a long time just to be able to turn them over to God and trust that He was going to do something with them. A very powerful experience that I had this spring with this whole theme that came to me probably in January of learning to release things was on Mother's Day, the worship service here at Fellowship. I entered worship in a very wounded state, very tender, crying. And I remember when the worship team began to sing the song called "Healing is in Your Hands." And as Greta sang this particular verse, it said, our present, our future. Our past is in your hands. We're covered by your blood. I had what I will call, for lack of a better term, it was probably a vision. It was almost like an out-of-body experience. I was transported back to my childhood home, and I was standing outside the house, and totally unexpected to me, this just played out just like a movie would play out. In my mind, I saw that house from the outside covered with Christ's blood. It started at the rooftop and it cascaded down the house. Then I was transported into my childhood room where some of the inappropriate sexual behavior occurred. And I saw myself as that 13-year-old girl, and the same thing happened with the blood starting gently at the top of her head and cascading down her body. And by this time I was pretty much slain, because it was really apparent to me that God was doing a healing work inside of me. But it didn't stop at that. I saw my father standing outside of the house, and I looked at him, and the same thing happened to him. The blood started at the top of his head and poured down his body. And it was as if God said to me, all your life, you have never felt that your father was worthy of my love. And Alberta, he's as worthy of my love and forgiveness as you were, or anyone else. And I felt the contempt and the anger that I'd had towards him be released. It was a miracle. When we talk about secrets, I think when it comes to addictions or sexual abuse or painful things like those, I think the shame is so strong that that's sometimes what keeps people from talking about it. They hold it in because they can't imagine how they might be judged. Or in many instances, the secret is kept to protect the family of origin. What would my siblings think if they heard that this happened? They'll accuse me of making it all up. Or I could never tell my mom that my dad sexually molested me because it would kill her. Those kind of things. The truth that I've found, at least, is that in a safe community, you may feel shame to tell your story, but it's not all about you. God can use that story to help someone else. And almost anyone who's in recovery knows that part of the recovery process is the lessening of shame. And that's a wonderful way to motivate yourself to tell some secrets. They're less powerful when they're told. And do I still struggle with the aftermath of what happened to me as a child? Absolutely. That's why I'm in recovery. I mean, God went way beyond anything I would ever dream or expect or even think of to help me in that healing process.